wonder if in that first instance it was kind of like
I'm sure it was.
Christian Bale playing Batman.
Trying to disguise his voice a little bit, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be.
I absolutely think it was. I think it also was to kind of play into that role of
I'm a thief.
I'm a thief. Yeah. I'm a bad guy. Well, he is a bad guy, but, you know.
I'm a different kind of bad
different
guy.
kind of bad guy than he is. Which I don't think he identifies himself as a bad guy. Let's be honest.
Too bad, yeah.
Yeah.
Really creepy bad guy.
Next up, Brian and Rosemary Linus were set to move out of their rented house on July 4th, 1990, which is not a holiday in Australia.
Why not?
Because
they're not patriotic.
They're not. That's true. Yes. They are not patriotic Americans.
No.
They, along with their 2 daughters, were a month away from moving back to England and had planned to rent an apartment in Melbourne for the last month in
Osland? Yeah.
In Australia.
Aussieland.
Yeah. On July 3rd at about 11:15 p.m., Mr. Cruel forced his way into Brian and Rosemary's bedroom via the window. Brian and Rosemary, however, were out at a farewell gathering, a fact that Mr. Cruel was likely very aware of. At 11:20 p.m., he woke Nicola up by tapping her on the head with his knife. This is the one that you were thinking of,
Yep.
Steve. The parents were not home, so yeah. But Nicola was home with her sister, Fiona. Once again, he claimed to be a common thief. He actually did hog-tie Fiona up this time on the parents' bed, and then told Nicola to get her school uniform.
Oh, he's that kind of guy, huh?
He had her dress in something other than her school uniform, and she kept her pajama bottoms on as well. And then Mr. Cruel asked Nicola and Fiona about their father's employment, then told Fiona that he wanted $25,000 ransom for Nicola. He went around the house and cut all of the phone lines with a knife, then told Fiona that he'd call in the morning with instructions on how to pay, so obviously he wasn't actually intending to call in the morning.
Yeah. They better call me once they get the repairman out here.
Well, I'm gonna call them.
It might
He
be.
didn't even leave anything.
Yeah.
He said, I'm gonna call.
Yeah, it might be quicker in Australia. I know here in America, back in those days, it took the phone company a while to get out to your house.
Weeks.
To fix your phone lines.
Yeah.
It did, back in the good old days.
Fiona said that she looked at the bedside clock and remembered that Mr. Cruel left with Nicola at 11:47 p.m. exactly. He also stole the family's car.
Well, they had 2 cars.
They did.
Because Mom and Dad were in one.
Yes. Yeah. He had Nicola again kneel on the passenger side floor, just like Shannon, and he pulled her baseball cap low over her eyes. She was apparently wearing a baseball cap. He drove for a short distance, and then they got out of the family car and into a different car where he blindfolded Nicola with tape and then put a ski mask over that.
Balaclava.
Clava.
Yeah. Once again, Mr. Cruel took Nicola to a house. She heard the radio playing. Once again, he removed the tape from her eyes and gently put iPads over her eyes as a blindfold. He took her to the bathroom, flossed and brushed her teeth, bathed her, then, calling her Nikki, raped and assaulted her.
Maybe this guy's a dental hygienist.
Maybe.
Yeah.
He's something.
Yeah.
He, again, leashed her to the bed around the neck, just like he had done with Shannon, and then he fell asleep next to her.
I tell you, that guy is pretty sure of himself.
Yeah.
I was going to say, of all of the things that this guy has done so far, that is
Creepiest.
Yeah.
For some reason,
Yeah,
the
it is.
creepiest.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
Yeah, because he's spooning this poor chained up little girl.
Yeah.
As if there's some actual intimacy between them. That's what just turns my gut so much on there.
She was 13, too. I mean, yeah.
11, 13, doesn't matter, still turns my
Little
gut.
girl. Yeah. He had actually turned the radio off while he went to sleep, so there was no noise. And of course, Nicola did not sleep that night.
Really?
Yeah. She didn't hear any noise until she heard really loud airplanes flying overhead. So she estimated there were about 7 or 9 of them that flew overhead in a relatively short span of time. Basically what she was describing was like the landing pattern of planes.
Yeah, like an airport or an army base or
exactly.
something like that.
Yeah.
That's actually good information.
Yeah, it is. Mr. Cruel slept until about 10 a.m. When he turned the radio back on. She heard, the radio said the time. He raped her again at 11 a.m., then fell asleep again next to her. Then at about 12:30 p.m., so noon 30, he took her into the bathroom where he raped her again, then bathed her again. Then he told her that he had a schoolgirl fantasy and that he had followed her home from school, which I think is also a red herring.
This guy just says whatever random
Yeah.
BS pops into his head.
He does. He dressed her in her uniform and then raped her in the kitchen. Then he gave her a glass of water and then leashed her to the bed. She fell asleep for a few hours because, like, of course she would. And then she said she woke up again to the sound of airplanes prior to 10 a.m. again. After 10 a.m., when she woke up and the radio was turned back on, he then dressed her in a tennis skirt that he had brought. He actually told her the night before he was going to dress her in a tennis skirt and rape her
This guy's
again.
hitting all the fantasies here, isn't he?
He is. But, so he told her that the night before, and then the next morning he dressed her in the tennis skirt and raped her. And then he started calling her Missy. At about 2 p.m. that day, he finally released her to the bed and said he wasn't going to, quote-unquote, assault her anymore. He tied her legs together with wire, gave her some food and water, and then told her a friend and he were going to go look for places to drop her off. He had a newspaper with him, and he said it was The Sun, which...
The Herald Sun?
The Herald Sun, which is where this was reported.
Conveniently enough.
Conveniently enough. At about 10 p.m., Mr. Cruel asked Nicola if she was hungry and said that he was going to pack all the food away, meaning that this was not a usual place of living, that he
For him.
packed food in and he was going to pack it out.
It would make sense not to bring her to his house.
Yep, absolutely would. He had Nicola stand on a sheet and then showered her and cleaned her body like he had Shannon's. He reportedly again said something to his friend that was also there with him, but investigators agree that this is just one of those attempts to derail the investigation again, because Nicola was pretty sure that there was no one else there. She didn't hear, it was a small house where she was being kept, and she didn't hear anybody else come in or
no sounds of footsteps.
And additional to that,
No
only
creaking
once
floorboards, yeah.
did he say anything to his friend, and his friend didn't say anything at all. So I don't think there was actually another person there with him.
So one thing you said here that you said about her and the prior victim that we didn't bring up in the very first one is her standing on a sheet in the bathroom. If I remember correct, the very first girl, trying to think of delicately how to say this, when he was with her in the bathroom and he assaulted her, I seem to remember there was something about the fact that he had laid down a shower curtain or a sheet or a towel or something, so that I'm guessing for the idea that his footprints or shoe prints or whatever wouldn't be liftable or retained in any way. So he's like, there are things that seem to be happening every single time.
Yeah, I mean, things like flossing, things like cutting their finger and toenails, like that. Forensic evidence, and especially public knowledge of forensic evidence, was not that great in the early 90s.
No,
so
not at
for
all.
him to know
He was a time traveler.
that maybe,
Could have been
honestly,
time traveler, could have,
the worst use for time travel ever.
Yeah, could have worked for a police department, maybe,
Yes.
a forensic kind of specialist sort of guy.
Yeah. So he was gonna pack it away. He was gonna pack all the food away. He cleaned Nicola again. Said something to his friend, which is wrong. Then he replaces her iPads with tape. He takes the iPads off and tapes her eyes shut. Blindfolds her with tape. Then he puts her clothes on her, but I guess it was a different set of clothes that he hadn't had any contact with, because he did take a number of sets of clothes from her house.
When he first took her from her home,
Yeah.
yes.
And then again, put her on the floor of the passenger side, and then again had car trouble, again saying stolen cars often don't turn on, which, okay. They drove for a while, and then...
They stopped for gas, didn't they?
Yeah, they stopped for gas. Well, she
that's-
thought they stopped for gas. She wasn't sure.
That's hard to believe because, unless it was self-serve or a
I'm
car,
sure
a
it
car
was.
block station or something like
Oh,
that.
I'm sure it was self-serve.
Yeah,
Oregon's one of the only places where it's not self-serve.
yeah.
In the world, almost.
Yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
seriously.
So he stopped for gas, apparently, maybe not. And he had actually wrapped her in a blanket when they were at the house. So they stopped finally after they stopped for gas, and then they drove around a little bit. Then he removed the sheet after they got out of the car and, took the sheet away from her. And then they walked about 5 minutes, I guess, she thought. And then Mr. Cruel had her change her clothes again, standing on that sheet, and then took all the clothes away that would have maybe had evidence from his house on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they walked for about 3 more minutes. And I guess he looked around, like he was going to stop, and then he said, no, this location isn't good for some reason. And then they walked for another 3 or 4 minutes. And then he said, okay, now count to 100. He took her blindfold off, said count to 100, and then, go call the police. She had been, again, left about 3 miles away from her house. It was 2 a.m. on the morning of her 14th birthday.
Hey, happy birthday.
She was found.
Yeah.
She had been held by Mr. Cruel for exactly 50 hours. She knocked on the door of a man, like they were in kind of a neighborhood where she was dropped. So she walked up to a door and knocked, and a man answered it, and she said, "Can I call my dad?" And obviously her picture had been everywhere.
Yeah.
And he was like, yes, of course you can. And they called the police. And then 6 days later, Nicola's family left Australia forever.
Nice send-off.
Yeah. Nicola and Fiona described Mr. Cruel to have a beer belly, which is different from the other descriptions. The other descriptions had him very slim.
I got to tell you, though, beer bellies come on pretty easily.
Yeah, and it had been a year or so since the last attack.
It's easy to fake a beer belly, too.
True story. And he was again described as having the gruff, uneducated voice. And apparently he also tended to add "use" to the end of sentences, like "lay down on the bed, use."
Oh, the word "you," not the letter "u."
Yeah, which is why I gave you an example.
Leu, downu,
Yeah.
anu, thou.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No. Those are really the only discrepancies between the other 3 descriptions of Mr. Cruel.
Because he didn't use a lot with the other ones, right?
No.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that he was just putting on voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. Next up is Carmen. It's not spelled like you think Carmen is spelled.
C-A-R-M-E-N?
It's K-R...
K-A.
It's Karmien. But from the news coverage of this case that I watched, it sounded like her mom was pronouncing it Carmen or something dang close. So her name's Carmen. And I'm going to preface this one by saying it's a little different, and then there is speculation that it's actually a copycat, but we'll talk about that later.
Cool.
Officially, it is the last known attack by Mr. Cruel. On April 31st, 1990, 13-year-old Carmen was babysitting her 2 younger sisters, Carly, who was 9, and Karen, who was 7. Lots of K alliteration here.
That is a really terrible thing to do to your children. You know why? Because if you ever get mail at the house with first initial, last name, you don't know whose mail it is.
That's a good point. I thought about that. I know people who've done that.
Oh, yeah, no, I have it.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean? Really? Yeah.
Mr. Cruel broke into the house at 8:40 p.m. Their parents owned 3 Chinese restaurants in town, and they actually ran them. They didn't just, own them. They were a fairly wealthy family in the community. And the parents were both working at the restaurant at the time. Again,
They were true owner-operators.
Yes, and Mr. Cruel very likely knew that. Again.
Maybe he ate there.
Yet
Or
again,
one of
it
the
sounds
restaurants.
like he did a lot of research.
Yes. Mr. Cruel instructed the 2 younger girls to get into the cupboard that was in the room that they were all sleeping in, and pushed a bed against the doors, which, locked them in, and then dragged Carmen by the hair out of the house. And I know that I guess I am speculating a bit there, but she was being held by the hair when the girls got into the cupboard, so I presume that he continued to drag her.
Okay.
That's a little bit of a departure for him, isn't it?
Tracker dogs were unable to track past a nearby road where it's speculated that Mr. Cruel likely parked his car. Carly and Karen managed to escape about 10 minutes after and called their father, and he, of course, called the police, and the search began. Mr. Cruel, per his M.O., left a red herring. He had spray-painted "Payback Asian Drug Dealer" on the front of the family's car that was left in the parking, or in the driveway.
So weird.
I am going to quickly note here that Carmen, she did attend the same all-girls school that Nicola attended.
Nicola was our second victim, right?
Third. Nicola's the most recent victim we just talked
Right.
about.
Okay.
And I read somewhere, though I don't remember where, that Mr. Cruel took Carmen's school uniform with them when they left.
Like he did with Nicola.
Makes sense.
The MO changes here drastically. Carmen was not released after 18 hours.
What
She was
50?
not released after 50 hours or 70 hours. In fact, she was not released at all.
Alive.
Well,
She wasn't released alive.
Technically, I suppose that's true.
2 years after she disappeared, a man walking his dog saw what he thought was a human skull in a landfill, and it ended up being Carmen's remains. She had been shot at least 3 times in the back of the head and then dumped in this landfill. Carly and Karen described Mr. Cruel in much the same way that Nicola and Fiona had. They didn't mention a gruff voice at all, but they did say that his ski mask was brown, which
depending on the
is
light.
different. Well, it's different than the navy blue one that had been described in all of the other crimes. Now, maybe that means that, you know, it was worn out or it got
It sat in the
stuff
sun
on it.
for a year.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have faded into brown, but it was, you know, anyway, it was different. This may have been a copycat.
Could have been.
And of course, the police did actually investigate the drug dealer
The spray painted message, yeah.
They actually, for like 3 years, they did an investigation into the family, and there was no connection. Nothing whatsoever. He was just a legitimate business owner. And the lead investigator makes a really, really good point here with this case as well, and that is that the family's house was not preserved as a crime scene in this instance. A ton of people came through, and you know, basically it was a manhunt. It wasn't a crime scene. So people carried away anything that might have been DNA.
They carried it away. Why?
Just by like walking over it or anything, not by physically picking it up.
I have a feeling that the fact that the daughters called Dad and Dad called the cops, probably after calling somebody else he knew to go over to the house, who then called somebody they knew. So there's a whole swarm of non-investigative types showing up.
Yeah. Right, and there's also probably people showing up, to help take care of the girls because they've just had something very traumatic happen to them. And overall, you know, there could have been clues left, though given the Mr. Cruel MO, I doubt it that there were any kind of clues.
Yeah, if it's him in this instance, then probably wouldn't have mattered.
And Carmen's mother has a theory about why Carmen was killed when the other girls were not. And it is that, by all accounts, Carmen was very stubborn.
Defiant.
And defiant is a really good word. And Mr. Cruel had actually told one of his other victims that his freedom was more important than her life. And Carmen's mother thinks that it's very likely that Carmen fought back and may have pulled the mask off, or otherwise been able to identify him, so he killed her and dumped her body.
Or just angered him enough.
Yeah.
Or maybe she actually recognized his voice and said, "Hey, Mr. Smith, that's you, isn't it?"
Absolutely possible.
What are you doing, Smithers?
Yeah. And actually, that's a great little segue, because we're done talking about the victims, and now we're going to talk about theories and suspects.
Okay.
Theories. Oh, yeah, there's about 32,000 theories here.
There are, actually, yeah. But the thing we're going to talk about first is that there was this task force called Spectrum that included several FBI investigators as well as police and other high-profile investigators from around the world.
That's the U.S. FBI, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
That came together to be a part of this task force, basically do one of the most comprehensive investigations like that has ever taken place. They interviewed literally 27,000, not 2,700, 27,000 men in the area in conjunction with this case as suspects.
This is a lot like the Naked Murders.
Yeah.
Where they just lock down a section of the city. Every man is drug in front of the cops and questioned till he's exhausted, and then they move on to the next one.
Yes, yeah. So from extensive interviews of the victims, of the families, just general kind of stuff, they put together this really comprehensive profile of the kind of person that Mr. Cruel would have been, or maybe still is, in his real life.
By the way, they shouldn't have called him Mr. Cruel. That's just too dignified. You should have called him Mr.
That's the newspaper's fault.
No, they should have called him Mr. Pervy Pants.
Well, they actually called him...
Rock Spider.
Yeah.
He had
Pervy Pants, I like it better.
7 or 8 different monikers that he was referred to by, and Mr. Cruel is just the latest one that has actually
That's the one that
taken.
stuck, yeah.
Something Rapist. It was like the North Something Rapist was one of the more common names until Mr. Cruel really
I think Mr. Cruel's a great name for him.
I think Mr. Pervy Pants is better, though. That would have made him angry.
So since
I don't think we want to do that, Joe.
Well,
yeah.
let's just talk about
Might
that
Okay, sorry.
in a
Make
little bit
mistake.
because it actually does pertain to a theory. So can one of you guys read this profile that they put together so it's not just an episode of me talking for like 12
That's
hours?
a good point.
Okay.
I got to put on my FBI voice.
Oh, I didn't know if you wanted paper, rock, scissors for it.
Oh, you want a Rochambeau?
I don't care.
Let's Rochambeau. Boom, boom, boom. Up.
Wait, does that mean I have to?
I
or-
guess that means you have to.
Oh, I didn't realize winning meant I had to read it.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay.
No, that's fine.
You got to do your FBI voice. so.
Okay. In my best FBI voice. This is going to be my Batman voice. Mr. Cruel was probably in steady employment, possibly in a management job or self-employed with freedom of movement. It said those who knew him would not regard him as a monster. He would probably be considered a good neighbor and might be involved in community projects. He would have an obsessive-compulsive character, the type who would immediately wipe his hands if soiled. He would have taken a great deal of interest in media coverage, though he probably tried to disguise it. He would likely go for unexplained drives or walks. He would have expressed sexual fantasies or shown sexually dysfunctional behavior. His sexual arousal and gratification would probably be dependent on his partner playing specific roles, such as dressing in a schoolgirl uniform. He used terms like bozo, worrywart, and missy when saying things to some of his victims, aka kitty talk. He could be married or living with a woman who goes away around school holidays when some of the attacks occurred. Or he could be a teacher himself. He would be intelligent and well organized. He would seem genuinely interested in and dedicated to children. He would have displayed
He actually was pretty interested in children.
Yes,
Yeah, unfortunately.
terrible observation.
Yeah.
He would have displayed behavioral changes around the time of the offenses and on anniversaries or when publicity was renewed. Those changes would indicate such things as sleeping disorders, reluctances to go to work, distraction, or different eating and drinking habits. He would disguise his dress with abnormally rigid behavior.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. FBI.
You're welcome.
One thing to note before we start talking about suspects, we're not going to talk about 27,000 suspects.
Damn it. This could have been a really long episode.
It could have. It already kind of is. But one thing just to note is that Mr. Cruel is a serial offender.
Well, yeah.
And we've talked about serial offenders before on this show. And basically what that means is it's unlikely that he would have stopped these attacks unless he was forced by either death or moving or some kind of incarceration.
Or he accomplished what he wanted. Whatever that might be.
I guess. Yeah.
God knows
I think what he
that could
wanted
be.
was to get his rocks off, so I don't think he could continue
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
accomplish that
And
in
there is-
perpetuity by just watching his videos.
But there's also a significant amount of escalation that happens. We
There
can
was.
see even just over the course of even just the first three, but really with the four, there's a fair amount of escalation. The investigators said that they thought the reason that he stopped was because he got scared because he was one of the 27,000 people that was interviewed, which, like, if he lived in the area, of course he was. So
Yeah, he and every other guy in the bar were like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you remember that time I got interviewed
Yeah.
if I was Mr. Cruel?"
Yeah. So there are officially 7 men on a list that is being held by it's distributed to all police in this area that basically says if any attack similar to the Mr. Cruel one happens, these 7 suspects should be arrested immediately or brought into custody immediately for questioning. But there are apparently 32 suspects that cannot officially be eliminated, but they don't have any evidence to prove that any of them did it either.
So they're not good enough to just immediately go out and arrest.
Exactly. In fact, none of them. Yeah, there's no suspect that is good enough to go out and arrest. Yeah.
So before we get into theory, or these, I guess not theories, but these particular suspects that you have here,
Yeah.
there are some general things that I'm wondering about.
Okay.
That we should probably get to now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay,
Let's just
sweet.
talk about
That's
it.
great. There's the question of the airplanes. And
Yeah.
Is it one or two of the girls
Well,
that were taken and
It was-
released?
It was 2, yeah. So no,
Nicola?
Shannon was the one who, like, right off the bat said, "Oh, and also I heard airplanes."
Lots of airplanes.
Yeah, and then Nicola was interviewed after she had returned to England,
Uh-huh.
and she said, I heard these were the airplanes and these are when I heard the airplanes. Because she was the one who was able to give, she actually counted. I don't know how, I guess she must have been aware of the news. She was 13, she might have been aware of the news. So she actually went so far as to, when she realized that she was being abducted by Mr. Cruel, she counted how long she was in the car from her house.
Right, she's the one who counted the steps and the stairs.
Well, Shannon did that, but she went even further than that, where she was able to basically give an entire layout of the house. She said, I counted to this number until we got to the car, and I think we were headed in this direction. And then I counted to this number from the car to the house. I mean, she was like incredibly detailed, but she eventually recalled. So both of the girls who were held in the house did recall the airplane.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and a lot of airplanes, or
well,
it's 7 seems to be a number that I've heard in a number of places. But my question is, there's two kinds of planes. There's jets and propeller planes. And what I'm trying to understand, was it a jet airplane or was it a propeller-driven plane?
You're thinking maybe a small airport versus a large international type
Well, the
airport,
reason I say that is that if you've ever heard airplanes at a distance and there's some other background noise, and then you've heard motorcycles in the distance, depending on what they are, they can sound similar, not the same. I understand they're not identical, but to a girl who's not on the motorcycle scene, it could sound like an airplane. So that's the reason I'm asking this.
Yeah, it's a good question. Nicola seemed to think that they were on the landing path of airplanes.
Okay.
So it's less jets landing.
Well, or less of the noise of just the airplane and there's sounds of descent.
Yes.
Okay.
She seemed to think they were lower than they should have been. Maybe not like right next to the airport, right? But on the flight path into the airport. And that would also be, I guess,
it's the northern part of Melbourne, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, but in addition to that, I mean, it would make sense that she would hear airplanes during some times and not others because, they have flight paths based on time of day and wind pattern and all of that stuff. So, if she heard it just kind of in this distinct time of the morning, that's when they were getting those planes landed.
That should give them an idea, kind of.
Shannon, I don't think was able to provide a whole lot of detail, but she was also only held for 18 hours versus Nicola, who was there for 50. So Nicola had 2 full days to observe the patterns of things, whereas Shannon she said she heard some airplanes, but she wasn't held really in the morning. I mean, she just heard a couple in the morning.
Okay.
When she was first there and she was still disoriented. So.
Okay, so the next question that I have is probably asking for more detail than you have or any of us want to know. But it is based around the fact of the frequency of the assaults that these girls reported that they got. I am presuming that they are not simply all acts of penetration.
The best description, the most descriptive that anybody gets is they say raped and assaulted.
Okay.
And I suspect that means that there was a varying degree of assault that was happening.
Okay.
I don't think it was always necessarily one body penetrating the other.
Yes, it wasn't penetrative.
Well, it may have been penetrative in that it was an object or a hand, but it wasn't. I don't think it was always necessarily.
And that's the reason I asked, because what really, really skeeved me out was some of the early articles that I read made it sound like this guy was on Viagra the whole...
Quite a lot. He was a pretty randy fellow.
Well,
yeah.
But I will just go ahead and say that physiology in general is a fickle thing. And I know, because you're talking about a refractory period of some sort, I presume.
Yes.
That doesn't always happen. Not all, I'm sorry to be woe-splaining to you about refractory periods, but in my experience, there are some men out there who don't, and especially under the right circumstances that are extra exciting, sometimes men don't have that period of time in between.
They can get right back into it,
Yeah.
Okay. They can. It does happen.
And maybe he was. I mean,
and obviously this was this guy's big turn on.
It was his thing. But I mean, even more than that,
show, yeah.
We don't know. Maybe he was taking Viagra because he was so...
did Viagra exist in
the
late
80s?
80s? In the 80s?
Yeah.
Did it?
I'm sure.
Yeah, it was in the mid 90s it became, but there was other things. There are other things that can have the same effect. But
Yeah.
Okay, so then my last question here is, so they say that he couldn't have stopped on his own.
Well,
And
they don't say that.
Well, they say he had, he was scared away, but that doesn't match up with behavior that we've talked about in the past. And, I mean, I have a theory as to why Carmen was the last one. And it's probably the most disturbing of all the theories out there.
Well, I guess my theory about why Carmen is the last one is that his murder of Carmen, in conjunction with the extensive nature of the investigation, in which he may have even been interviewed by the police, just scared him off entirely.
That would make
where
sense.
It just became, like he said, his freedom was more important than anything, and it just became too risky for him to continue to do this. So he found it by, reviewing the tapes or slides or pictures and, being able to carry out role plays with consenting partners.
And that's probably the most disturbing part. The most disturbing idea that I've come to is why this guy stopped is he met somebody. And at first I was like, well, for every kink, there's somebody who's happy to fulfill that kink. But for this guy, I don't think it's an adult woman dressing up like a schoolgirl and letting him play act to do whatever he wants.
Well,
what really disturbs me is that he met a woman who was down with his kink, who had a daughter, and said, here is your smorgasbord, and he suddenly was off of the market.
It does happen.
It does, but I mean, kids age pretty quick. So if his thing was an 11-year, the 10 to 13 range, pre-puberty.
Listen, we've talked about guys who started assaulting young girls at the age of 5 and didn't stop until they were 30.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, there are stories like that. So it doesn't mean that just because she was no longer 12, she was no longer useful in that manner.
Sure.
Is the nicest way I can say it.
Let's just hop in.
Okay.
We're only going to talk about 3 suspects, and none of them are named. Don't worry.
That's a good thing.
Well, I call them something, but
yeah, we have our own names for them, but one of them is just called John, aka John Doe. And I'm just gonna, because it's a good transition into this. John was brought to the attention of the police because he had a partner, a consenting adult
AKA
female
girlfriend.
Partner. Yeah. Girlfriend, sexual partner. I'm not quite sure which. That said that John started talking about Carmen during sex while they were role-playing schoolgirl stuff, and then was apparently really upset when the media dubbed the killer Mr. Cruel.
I don't know why it's upset. I mean, at least they didn't dub him Mr. Pervy Pants.
Yeah. And then John...
Rock Spider.
John was apparently self-employed and traveled a lot, so he had a reason to disappear on the job. And while police took this claim seriously, the ex had a lot of discrepancies in her story, and they kind of thought, well, we're obviously going to investigate this person, but it kind of seems like this person is just trying to get revenge on John.
This is the same thing that we've talked about with exes before. Last week when we talked about Abel and the fact that Abel only came to the police's attention after his soon-to-be third ex, spilled the beans, quote-unquote, spilled the beans on him, which really was just to bring down hell on him.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, and she succeeded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our next, and I apologize, I think sometimes we do these stories and our listeners are like, you guys just told the story and then like haphazardly threw like 3 sentences on each theory and like that's it. But that's literally, you can do the research. I hope you will do the research and follow some of the links to some of the stuff that we found, and there's nothing. There's really nothing. So we're going to talk about 2 other suspects.
Well, I will just say, why is it the show always puts me in the weird position of